In the grand, gold-drenched halls of Versailles, where every mirror once shimmered with the image of absolute power, another kind of reflection started to emerge by 1774. Not one of glory, but of rot. Behind the glittering facade, decay had already taken hold. The man once adored as Louis the Well-Beloved would die reviled, Louis the Hated. His body, ravaged not just by disease but by the very poison of his own rule, became a grotesque metaphor for a monarchy in collapse. This is the story of how one king's moral decay manifested in the physical destruction of his body, how his rotting corpse became the perfect, putrid symbol of a regime that had already begun to devour itself from the inside out. The reign of Louis XV is one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune in history, a stark warning about what happens when power is left unchecked and responsibility abandoned. When smallpox finally claimed him in May of 1774, it did so with such horrifying violence that even his most devoted attendants couldn't bear to stay in the room. They fled from the overwhelming stench of death and decay. But the horror of Louis XV's final days was just the last scene in a decades-long tragedy, one that would pave the way for a revolution that would shake the world. To understand the sheer collapse of this once promising monarch, we have to go back, not to the deathbed, but to the beginning. Picture a 5-year-old boy, newly orphaned, being placed on the throne of the most powerful nation in Europe. That image, of innocent youth thrust into unimaginable power, stands in chilling contrast to the diseased, decaying figure he would become. Between those two bookends is the full collapse, both moral and physical, of a king who had once embodied France's hope. It all started in 1715. The death of Louis XIV, the Sun King, marked the end of a 72-year reign that had defined an entire era. He left behind a kingdom rooted in absolute monarchy and buried in debt. His heir, Louis XV, was just 5 years old. The weight of the crown fell on the small shoulders of a child who'd already lost both of his parents. He inherited not just a throne, but the expectations of a people who had only ever known one king. In the years that followed, France was governed by a regent, Philippe II, Duke of Orleans. It was a relatively liberal time, a momentary breath of fresh air after the suffocating final years of the previous reign. The economy began to recover from the devastating cost of endless wars. Meanwhile, young Louis received the best education possible. Tutors instructed him in languages, philosophy, math, history, and the art of war and diplomacy. And he wasn't just a quiet student. He was intelligent, curious, and full of promise. When he officially took power in 1723, the people of France genuinely adored him. He was handsome, articulate, and carried the hopeful aura of a new beginning. That's when they started calling him Louis le Bien-Aimé, Louis the Well-Beloved, and they meant it. His early reign seemed to validate that affection. He married Marie Leszczyńska, the daughter of a deposed Polish king. It was a diplomatic win that also appeared, at first, to be a happy union. Marie gave him a large number of children, securing the royal succession. At the same time, Louis supported science, philosophy, and the arts, keeping France at the cultural forefront of Europe. To many, it seemed like the dawn of a new golden age. But even in these early, promising years, cracks were beginning to form. The first warning sign: indecision. Louis XV had a worrying tendency to lean on favorites, especially women, for political guidance. He lacked the steel will of his great-grandfather. While Louis XIV had carefully curated an image of divine power and rigid discipline, Louis XV preferred pleasure over statecraft. Slowly, the court began transforming into a place known less for grandeur than for gossip, scandals, and libertine behavior. The fall from grace wasn't immediate. It happened step by step, through botched wars, mounting debt, and endless scandal. Every blunder chipped away at the people's trust, until the man once seen as France's great hope was viewed as its greatest liability. His first major challenge came with the War of the Austrian Succession in 1740, a brutal conflict that would drag on for 8 years. France jumped in to counter British influence and support its allies, but the campaign was a disaster. The military lacked direction, strategy was unclear, and it all reflected the growing dysfunction at the heart of Louis XV's court. The war cost a fortune. France plunged deeper into debt. The army, once feared across Europe, suffered humiliating defeats. Louis XV tried to rally the nation by leading troops personally, which earned him temporary respect. But the reality was, he wasn't a military mastermind. His battlefield decisions were often shaped more by the whispers of courtiers than by any coherent plan. Around this time, his marriage began to fall apart. Louis increasingly turned to his mistresses, not just for comfort, but for counsel. His most famous mistress, Madame de Pompadour, became his closest advisor. She wasn't just a lover, she helped shape French domestic and foreign policy. And while she was intelligent and cultured, her presence at the center of power infuriated both the nobility and the public. They saw it as proof that the king's court had become a brothel of influence, where favor could be won not by merit, but by seduction. When the war finally ended in 1748 with the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, France gave back nearly all the territory it had fought for. The people were outraged. Sons had died. Families were taxed into ruin. And for what? It felt like a pointless, bloody detour, a king's vanity project with nothing to show for it. The fallout was immediate. Public opinion turned. The affectionate nickname, well-beloved, now felt like a cruel joke. Louis XV responded to the criticism by retreating even deeper into his private world. He surrounded himself with yes-men and refused to confront the growing unrest outside the palace gates. Throughout the 1750s, life in France got harder for ordinary people, while the king sank further into decadence. The gap between Versailles and the rest of the country grew wider by the year. Scandals multiplied. Rumors about the king's lavish spending on his mistresses, especially the private retreat he built for Madame de Pompadour at Petit Trianon, fueled growing rage. The king seemed more interested in luxury and lust than in the needs of his people. Then came the 7 Years' War, beginning in 1756, a truly global conflict. France fought Britain and Prussia for dominance across Europe, North America, and beyond. From the outset, France was outmaneuvered and outmatched. The empire began to crumble. Canada, Louisiana, lost. It was a national humiliation. And still, Louis XV seemed indifferent. He stayed in Versailles, entertained by court rituals and private pleasures, while his people watched their nation fall apart. The defeat in the 7 Years' War wasn't just a military failure. It was a shattering blow to France's global influence and national pride. By the time the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1763, Louis XV had presided over the loss of most of France's overseas empire. Canada was gone. Louisiana ceded. India largely forfeited. France had gone from colonial superpower to second-tier player on the world stage. And while the pain of the loss was felt across the nation, the blame fell squarely on the king. The public's trust in Louis XV, already fraying, now began to completely unravel. The man who had once been hailed as the future of France was now seen as its curse. He wasn't just out of touch, he was dangerous. His failures, indulgences, and lack of direction had pushed France into decline. But rather than confront this reality, Louis did what he had always done. He withdrew into the luxury of Versailles, further isolating himself from the country he was supposed to lead. The years after the war didn't bring peace. They brought more problems. France's financial system was in tatters. The state had borrowed heavily to fund wars it couldn't afford, and now it was drowning in debt. The tax system remained brutally unfair. The common people, farmers, artisans, the urban poor, carried the weight, while the nobility and clergy lived tax-free. The king had the power to change this. He chose not to. Repeated attempts at reform were made by finance ministers like Étienne de Silhouette and Jean-Baptiste de Machaut d'Arnouville. They proposed taxes on the privileged classes, cuts to extravagant spending, and structural overhauls. But every attempt ran into the same wall: entrenched interests, court resistance, and a king who refused to take a stand. Louis would often support reform in theory until someone important complained. Then he'd back off. As the economy staggered and the debt ballooned, anger among the people turned into despair. Riots over food and cost of living broke out in towns and cities across France. Crops had failed in several consecutive years, and bread prices soared. The people were starving while the court dined in gold. The contrast between Versailles and the slums of Paris became more than symbolic. It became unbearable. Meanwhile, Louis's personal behavior only made things worse. His relationships with royal mistresses were no longer romantic intrigues whispered in court corridors. They were public scandals. Madame de Pompadour remained a powerful figure until her death in 1764. But the king soon replaced her with Jeanne Bécu, better known as Madame du Barry. Madame du Barry was everything the public despised. Unlike Pompadour, who at least had intellect and artistic patronage on her side, du Barry was widely seen as vulgar, manipulative, and openly greedy. Her rapid ascent from common origins to the pinnacle of royal favor infuriated both the nobility and the public. She wasn't just a mistress, she was a political player, with real influence over appointments and decisions. Many saw her as the ultimate sign of how far the monarchy had fallen. Court gossip about du Barry's behavior and the king's doting indulgence spilled into the streets. Pamphlets and satirical cartoons mocked the aging king, now depicted as a senile puppet in the hands of a courtesan. Versailles had become a palace of shame. Louis, once the bright hope of France, was now a figure of ridicule. Religious tensions also fueled the king's downfall. In 1764, Louis XV supported the expulsion of the Jesuits from France, a move that pleased certain Enlightenment thinkers and segments of the nobility, but deeply alienated devout Catholics. Many saw it as yet another sign that the king had turned his back on tradition and faith. For a monarch who was supposed to be God's representative on earth, this was more than a political misstep. It was a betrayal. His relationship with the Parlement of Paris, France's highest court, also collapsed during this period. The Parlement had traditionally acted as a check on royal authority, especially regarding taxes and legal reforms. But Louis, increasingly frustrated with their resistance, dissolved and replaced them with more obedient bodies. This move backfired spectacularly. Rather than reasserting control, it exposed his insecurity and fueled accusations of tyranny. And then there was the Enlightenment. The mid-18th century wasn't just a time of political and economic crisis. It was a time of radical ideas. Philosophers like Voltaire, Rousseau, and Diderot were challenging the very foundations of monarchy and religion. They argued for reason over tradition, liberty over absolutism, and the rights of individuals over the divine right of kings. At first, their ideas circulated mostly among the educated elite. But by the 1760s and 70s, Enlightenment thinking was seeping into broader French society, into salons, newspapers, coffee houses, and even working-class taverns. And Louis XV? He was the perfect villain for their arguments. A lazy, corrupt monarch more interested in hunting and sex than leadership. He became the living proof of everything they warned against. The more he tried to censor their work, the more popular they became. Banned books were printed in Switzerland and smuggled into France. Underground papers ridiculed the king and exposed court scandals. Songs and street performances mocked his authority. Even among the upper classes, the idea that the monarchy might not be eternal began to take hold. In 1757, a man named Robert François d'Amiens attempted to stab Louis XV. The wound was superficial, but the message was clear. Not even the king was safe anymore. D'Amiens was executed in a brutal public spectacle meant to reinforce royal authority. But instead, it reinforced something else. That the king was hated enough to be targeted and pitied enough to inspire little sympathy. The final years of Louis XV's reign were marked by increasing irrelevance. France was slipping on the world stage. Its colonies were gone. Its economy was paralyzed, and its people were seething. One of the most embarrassing moments came with the partitions of Poland in the late 1760s and early 1770s. Despite France's traditional alliance with Poland and its once considerable influence in Eastern Europe, Louis could do nothing to prevent the country's dismemberment by Russia, Prussia, and Austria. He didn't act decisively, didn't intervene. Another humiliation, another sign of France's weakened hand, another blow to the king's prestige. By the early 1770s, Louis XV's health was starting to decline. He looked tired, gaunt, and aged beyond his years. Some attributed it to stress, others to guilt, and still others to the weight of failure finally catching up with him. Despite this, he carried on with the same routines: long hunts, elaborate court rituals, evenings spent with Du Barry. Nothing changed, but outside Versailles, everything was changing. The people were angrier, the protests were louder, the pamphlets more vicious. France was like a pressure cooker, and Louis seemed determined to pretend it wasn't heating up. The court danced, the nobles feasted, the king kept hunting. All while the country drifted toward the edge of revolution. In those final years, the monarchy had become a parody of itself. Out of touch, bloated with privilege, riddled with corruption. The people didn't see Louis XV as a father figure anymore. They saw him as the problem. And when the end finally came, it was fitting. Almost too fitting. In May of 1774, the end finally came, and it was every bit as grotesque and symbolic as his reign had been. Louis XV fell ill with smallpox, the same disease that had taken his parents when he was a child. At first, the court assumed it was just another passing fever. The king had always appeared remarkably robust, even into his 60s. But this time was different. His condition deteriorated rapidly. Lesions covered his skin, his body began to swell, and the odor of infection soon filled the royal chambers. Doctors could do nothing. Treatments of the time were primitive: bleeding, herbal poultices, endless prayers. None of it helped. The king's body began to decompose while he was still alive. His flesh blackened. His breath came in gasps. The stench became so unbearable that courtiers and servants, those who had once fawned over him, begged to be released from their duties. Even his own daughters couldn't stay in the room for long. What should have been a solemn, dignified end to a long reign became a horror story. His once beautiful face was unrecognizable. Worms reportedly appeared in his sores. Versailles, that monument to splendor and power, became the setting for a death more gruesome than fiction. And as he lay dying, the people outside the palace gates did not mourn. They rejoiced. Across Paris, crowds gathered in the streets. News of the king's decline spread like wildfire, and instead of prayers, there were cheers. Songs mocking Louis XV were sung in taverns. Pamphlets circulated with caricatures of his bloated corpse. To many, his death felt less like the passing of a monarch and more like the fall of a hated tyrant. He had entered the throne as a child, bathed in hope and love. He left it as a husk, abandoned, rotting from within, both literally and metaphorically. When the end finally came on May 10th, 1774, it was not just the death of a man, it was the death of an illusion. The idea of a divine, infallible king who ruled by God's will was now a laughingstock. Louis XV had lived long enough to see the monarchy lose its sacred aura and become a target for ridicule, rage, and rebellion. His funeral reflected that shift. Unlike his great-grandfather Louis XIV, whose death was marked by grand public displays of mourning, Louis XV's body was rushed out of Versailles in the dead of night. There was no procession, no weeping crowds lining the roads. His remains were quickly transported to Saint-Denis, the traditional resting place of French kings. But even there, the stench was so overwhelming that the guards assigned to the tomb fainted. No one wanted to be near him, not in life, not in death. And yet, his legacy lived on, in the worst way possible. By the time his grandson, Louis XVI, took the throne, the monarchy was already on the edge of collapse. The debt Louis XV had ignored was now crushing. The reforms he had delayed were now urgent. The public fury he had fueled was now explosive. Louis XVI inherited a kingdom already set on fire, and though he would try to undo the damage, it was far too late. The rot that had consumed Louis XV's body had already spread to the institution of the monarchy itself. The Enlightenment thinkers he tried to suppress would go on to become the intellectual architects of revolution. The inequality he refused to address would erupt in bread riots, barricades, and bloodshed. And the people he had ignored, generation after generation, would soon rise, not just to demand reform, but to end the monarchy altogether. By 1789, the revolution had begun. The Bastille fell. The king was dethroned. And 5 years after that, Louis XVI, his grandson, was executed by guillotine. The French monarchy, which had ruled for centuries with divine authority, was gone. Louis XV didn't die during the French Revolution, but in many ways it died with him. His reign is now remembered not for grandeur or glory, but for decay, for being the long, slow unraveling of a system that refused to evolve. A monarchy that held tight to privilege while ignoring the pain of its people. A king who once symbolized hope, but who came to embody everything his country had grown to despise. Today, when historians talk about Louis XV, they don't speak of greatness, they speak of warnings. Warnings about what happens when power becomes a personal playground, about the dangers of isolation, arrogance, and denial, about what it looks like when a leader stops leading and the state starts to rot from the top down. Versailles still stands. Its mirrors still reflect. But now, they reflect something else. A cautionary tale written in gold and blood, about a king who became his own downfall, and a nation that refused to wait any longer for change. Louis XV may have died alone, unloved and decaying, but his legacy? It lived on in revolution. In the end, he didn't just lose the love of his people, he became the final symbol of a world that was about to disappear forever.